But generally, the Army itself neither cheered nor complained. Everybody appears entirely indifferent to the matter, one soldier said. Heroes of many defeats, we are not inclined to give gratuitous confidence to anyone. And that is a characteristic of the Army that will continue to the end of the war. This Army never again attempted to identify with an individual commander, not even Grant. Unlike the Army of Northern Virginia, which identified wholly with Robert E. Lee, the Army of the Potomac ultimately identified with itself. One wag from New York, most of them are from New York, wrote after Hooker's appointment, when a man is hauling a heavy load up a hill, he has no time to stop and swap jackasses. So there was hope, cautious, but there was still the question of the Army itself. And to Hooker's credit, he gave the most attention to those things that he could affect. He instituted a number of reforms which are well known and famous to most of you. He attended to the physical condition of his troops. Jonathan Letterman, one of the most important figures in American military history, much less the Army of the Potomac, instituted a series of physical improvements to the camp that seem so fundamental to us today, but fundamentally changed how the Army functioned during times in camp, which, of course, remember in 1863, a typical soldier might be under fire for maybe 8 hours in the whole year. So how an Army functioned in camp was very important. In fact, one of the very few people, there are two people that Hooker singles out for praise. One is John Reynolds, and the other is Jonathan Letterman. And actually says that Letterman deserves much of the credit for the improvements that Hooker, implemented. Cleanliness in camp, all of these basic things that we've come to see. And the drop in the rates of diarrhea and dysentery were dramatic. The incidence of desertion dropped dramatically. The food improved. Bakeries sprouted up across Stafford County where the Union camps were. Fresh bread, potatoes, vegetables, all of them came into the Army. One Irishman wrote, "I like Joe better now than I did 2 months before," and I think every Irishman in the Army is of the same opinion. We get more potatoes in a week now than we used to get in a month. He issued furloughs, a practice that made Lincoln very nervous, fearing that soldiers would never come back. He issued whiskey rations, which surprised nobody who knew of Hooker's reputation as a drinker. One soldier said, "He and his staff apparently devote a great deal of time to inspecting the courts," he said. His most famous innovation or reform was probably in some ways the least important, but it's the most collectible today, and that is the institution of corps badges. That we know, with each corps having a distinctive symbol. In fact, he did this largely for negative reasons. That was so that stragglers could be identified as to where they had come from and be sent back to their commands instantly. In fact, it turned out to be a very positive thing. Now, soldiers became very proud of their corps badges, and collectors today love them. But it was, in fact, instituted largely for negative reasons. He instituted a series of reviews, and allowing an Army to see itself was a powerful tool of commanders. We often hear about these reviews and we think about them as just being show, and they were. Lincoln came down in April of 1863 for a review of the entire Army over the course of several days. But the greatest value of these reviews was not in Lincoln seeing the Army, but in the Army seeing itself. And again, reinforcing that identity that it had. One soldier said, after an opportunity of seeing our Army as I have had this last week, I cannot help but concluding that the Army of the Potomac is a collection of as fine troops as there are in the world. I believe the day will come when it will be a proud thing for us to have served in this Army. That was a quote in a letter written directly after one of these reviews. Another soldier said, there is growing confidence in General Hooker. The winter of discontent is passing away, and the natural winter too. The elasticity of the American mind is strikingly exhibited in the hopeful spirit which in the main now characterizes the Army. That was written in April. Now, of course, Hooker had a number of advantages. This was the longest period of quiet the Army had experienced in over a year, the first extended period of quiet that it had had. That was important for sure. But he also had some advantages. The high command of the Army had been purged, if you will, of intriguers. It's very interesting and somewhat ironic that one of the greatest advantages that Joseph Hooker had as commander of the Army is that he didn't have Joseph Hooker within the Army. Hooker didn't enter the political fray, so the political tumult that characterized McClellan's period of command was absent. And also, the Army and the country, too, were becoming, despite the presence and rise of Copperheads and despite the deep divides, became ever more accustomed to and accepting of the more radical measures that the war entailed. And one of the most interesting things I found in January of 1863, right after the Emancipation Proclamation, it's hard to find a letter written from the Army of the Potomac that doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation. Yay or nay. Go a year later, January of 1864, from the camps around Culpeper, it's hard to find a letter that mentions emancipation as an issue anywhere. It was just like any other social change in America, where there's tremendous debate upon its anticipation, tremendous uproar upon its implementation, and then slow, quiet, eventual acceptance. We've seen that in our own lives. We've seen the pattern exactly that in the last several years on social issues in our own society today. Confidence in the government and respect for it is reestablished, wrote one soldier, as the soldiers see more fully the depths of the principle involved in the controversy. Now that's an important point, because these soldiers became intensely engaged in the political context of the war that winter. I believe that the armies of 1861 to 1865 probably, I would argue, were the most politically aware armies that we've ever had sent out into the field. They knew why they were there. They knew what was at stake. And they knew how the war was changing. With all this, Hooker still had to fight a battle. Still had to win a campaign, because that, after all, was what he was there for. And all of this was prelude to that. And of course, we're not going to get into a tremendous discussion of the campaign at Chancellorsville. You can read about that. It's summary pieces. Suffice to say that Hooker successfully engaged in a turning movement against Lee, putting himself on Lee's flank at Chancellorsville on April 30th, 1863. Even George Gordon Meade cheered the moment. He said, "Hurrah for old Joe. We're on Lee's flank and he doesn't know it." Next day, May 1st, the Army was going to march. Jerry? Thank you. You can put that on your resume next time. This triumphant moment. And of course, what did Hooker do? He boasted of the moment. He boasted not retrospectively, but prospectively. He said, "Lee must ingloriously fly." He issued an address to his army, which caused some unease in the army, a mixture of unease and joy, because it seemed the success that they had sought was upon them. At least they hoped. And then, of course, the army began to move on May 1st, out the roads leading from Chancellorsville, and let's see if we get this. I'm trying 3 times and then, oh, Wow. You were just thinking at that time.
Tired of standing up.
The Army moves out from Chancellorsville on various roads, encounters the Confederates, and then Hooker stops. And then Hooker pulls back to the Chancellorsville, this tight, solid line around the Chancellorsville intersection that you see there. And I don't want to get into a critique of that, other than to suggest a couple of things. And whether or not this was the right thing to do, Stephen Sears argues that it was his plan all along. I don't see the evidence of that myself. And the primary thing that I would cite was the astonished surprise of virtually all of Hooker's subordinates. Not down the chain, but Meade and Couch and Slocum and Gouverneur Warren, who was his chief topographical engineer, who helped plan the campaign. If, as has been suggested, this was the plan all along, it was the plan that Hooker had kept to himself. And that, combined with the boastings of what he would do to Robert E. Lee, not defeat him, but bag him, that he must ingloriously fly, the decision to pull back into the position around Chancellorsville, regardless of its merits, reflected a manager who was not managing his people well. You can't surprise your people like that and expect them to embrace what you're doing when it seems to them to be exactly opposite of everything you had said that you were going to do. Warren would write of this moment, "We went forward filled with high hope and courage, and I thought a great victory was to be ours. My mind expanded to the greatness of this event. Onward strike. We halted, though. We hesitated. We wavered, retired. That force which had thus turned us back seemed to me to be just made for us to crush. I know we could have done it. How few are the minds that comprehend things as they are, not as they seem. Men of mind weigh the responsibility before they engage. In the hour of trial, they are equal to the occasion. They who are bold away from danger cower before the reality. I feel today the drooping spirits of baffled hopes." And this is a man who was in Hooker's inner circle. It's just an interesting observation that he implies and that Meade more explicitly articulates later. And this idea that nothing inspires conservatism. I mean that with a little c, not big C. Nothing inspires conservatism like responsibility. Nothing modifies the implication, or the desire to boast prospectively, than the responsibility of actually making it happen. And so over time, we almost all learn not to do that. And it was not something Hooker learned as well. He would, of course, be defeated at Chancellorsville by a force that was about half of his size. He would declare it a great success. He would lay the blame for the defeat on others, which was his wont, of course. Most anxiously, he laid the blame on the Union 11th Corps, commanded by Oliver Otis Howard, that pious soldier whom Hooker came to despise above all others. And he would spend much of the rest of his life taking every opportunity he could to diminish Howard in significant ways. But I will point this out to you. So the ultimate impact of Chancellorsville on the Union war effort, you would think after the Mud March, after Fredericksburg, that a crushing defeat against a force half your size would have caused the Union war effort and the Army of the Potomac to just like, holy cow. In fact, Lincoln thought so. What will the country say? What will the country say, he said. Well, what did the country say? Not much. Not much. This perfect Confederate victory moved the needle hardly at all. And really, in many ways, demonstrates, Chancellorsville does, while it has kind of internal importance in Virginia and obviously opened the way for Lee's first invasion of the North, it demonstrates that this war had become so big and so complicated that a single defeat or victory anywhere in this war could only move the needle so much. And no one was more frustrated by that fact than Robert E. Lee, who saw the perfect battle virtually bear minimal fruit at Chancellorsville. Hooker, of course, would blame others, Sedgwick, George Stoneman, and he would do it in ugly form as he got older. Now, Hooker would continue in command after the Battle of Chancellorsville. He would ultimately be removed from command at his own request, at his own offer, just a couple days before the Battle of Gettysburg, over a rather piddly dispute over the disposition of some troops at Harper's Ferry during the march to Gettysburg. It was Joseph Hooker's choice that he was not the commander at the Battle of Gettysburg. He offered his resignation, and Lincoln said, "Okay, see you later." And he didn't resign. He actually he asked to be relieved, and was relieved from command of the Army of the Potomac. He left the Army under a pall of disappointment. George Gordon Meade, who would replace him, wrote of him after Chancellorsville, "Hooker has disappointed all his friends by failing to show his fighting qualities in a pinch." And that is indeed the way it's come down to us over time. But that failure is exacerbated and highlighted by the verbiage that surrounded it. And it's an abject lesson in the virtues of modesty and the perils of boastfulness, for sure. Now, the Army continued on. And one of the things that interests me very much, in fact, kind of the focus of most of the work that I do is the Army of the Potomac, is that it was able to continue on. After Chancellorsville, there's a diminishment in morale for sure, but it's interesting. Hooker's efforts to localize the failure at Chancellorsville with the 11th Corps, which was a partially immigrant group composed by a great many Germans and Eastern European soldiers. About 40% of the Corps was that. Ultimately, when an organization fails, organizations survive in part by finding internal, localized reasons for that failure rather than accepting the failure as a commentary on the whole. And that worked very well for the Army of the Potomac after the Battle of Chancellorsville, where the soldiers of almost every other corps were simply able to dismiss what happened because it was the 11th Corps. And it no doubt pleased Hooker that he could pin this on a man he despised at the same time, Oliver Otis Howard. So you don't see the Army sag as it did after Fredericksburg and after the Mud March. Instead, you see it pick itself up in a way clearly that Abraham Lincoln never expected, and to march on to Gettysburg and win by far its most important battle of the war. And I would argue that while Gettysburg, we like to, the storybooks tell us that it's the turning point of the war, blah, 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 the most important battle of the war. We can all argue whether or not that's true. For the Army of the Potomac, there's no question that it was. For the Army of the Potomac, maybe not the nation, but for the Army of the Potomac, Gettysburg was a turning point, where the identity it had generated of itself and its commitment to its own success found expression, finally, in victory. This army is a truly wonderful army, wrote one officer on the eve of Gettysburg. They have something of the English bulldog in them. You can whip them time and again, but the next fight they go in good spirits again. Another soldier wrote, everyone blows about this army. If the Army of the Potomac would only do so-and-so, then everything will go all right. They say when at the same time there isn't a department in the service that has done as much hard forced marching or fought as many battles as we have. It's true, we have not been victorious. But the fault is not in the troops, for never have been men known to fight as this army has fought, even when we knew we were outgeneraled and defeated. Any man will fight when flushed with former victories, but it is only this shattered army that will face the enemy, though defeat be certain. And the identity of that army, forged over 2 years, came into focus during Hooker's command. And that, perhaps, is Joseph Hooker's greatest legacy, greatest contribution to the war. There is no arguing, no diminishing that period from January 26, 1863 until May 1st, 1863, as one of the most important periods in the history of the Army of the Potomac. And I would argue the period during which the Army took on its identity, to some degree its structure, that would carry it through much greater struggles to come. After Gettysburg, Hooker would be reassigned eventually to command the 20th Corps, the 11th and 12th Corps sent out to the Western Theater. We're not going to get into that at all, other than to say that his tenure in command ended when he was slighted once again. When Oliver Otis Howard, after McPherson was killed, received command of that army, Hooker said, "I'm done," and offered to be relieved from his position. He was, and then would hold lesser commands throughout the war, and commence a campaign of terrorism in the Western Theater as well against his superiors. He resented Sheridan for getting command in Virginia, as he did, and he hated William Tecumseh Sherman. For the private part of the indignity, Hooker wrote, of Sherman appointing Howard over him, it would have given me the greatest satisfaction to have broken my saber over the head of Sherman. And this is written to a United States Senator, by the way, Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. Sherman is crazy. He has no more judgment than a child, and yet it is with such men that the high places of the Army are being filled. And even Grant, in the same letter he wrote of Grant, this is in December of 1864, Grant is determined to have no officer of ability near him in rank. Unless the Senate should interpose, our armies will be more and more feebly commanded as the war progresses. And of course, what he wanted the Senate to interpose in favor of was him being restored to some command. He would not be. He would stay in service until 1868, having suffered a stroke in 1865 and another one in 1867. He did get married. His wife lived 3 years. She died in 1868. And after the war, he would go on something of an interview tour, giving interviews to pretty much anyone who asked for one. And rhythmically, throughout the years between 1870 and 1879, the year he died, those interviews would appear in northern newspapers. And while they don't necessarily tell us a lot that is historically significant about the events he narrated, they are certainly vivid windows into the psyche of Joseph Hooker. And I would just close with that no organization can prosper well with a person, a man, like Joseph Hooker within it. Those who not only seek to advance themselves, but to do so by ripping others down. Those of you who manage have had people like that. Those of you who know how difficult it is to manage a situation like that. But, as Hooker demonstrates, every once in a while, a person with those characteristics who rises into a position that they aspire to, unobstructed now, where they don't necessarily have to answer to anybody else, can succeed. When, for a few short months in the spring and late winter of 1863, Joseph Hooker stopped his backbiting, his denigrating of others, and focused on the improvement of the Army under his command without having to worry to achieve that. And that, as I have said, is his greatest legacy. I'm glad to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions. Anybody?
Will, you're welcome to defend yourself if you wish. Right?
John, I just wondered if it's true that Sidney Crosby is the biggest crybaby in the National Hockey League.
Only by those people who don't watch him on a regular basis do people think that. That's I would just point out, while I asserted the similarities between Will and Ambrose Burnside before, I just detected a similarity between Will and Joseph Hooker right there.
Very good.
All right. Oh, you got one more.
I just want to, Fighting Joe Hooker, you hear that a lot. Is that a name he picked up very early on? And was he named that by someone in a specific thing, or is it just something that's grown over time?
Yeah, it was actually kind of a misconstruence of a newspaper report that Hooker is still fighting, or that something fighting, comma, Joe Hooker, but there was no comma there. It was a name that Hooker himself said that he didn't like, although he occasionally later in the war referred to himself by that name. But he said it made him sound like a wagon master or a hay dealer. But yes, it was a transcription error in a newspaper that ultimately led to the... And Lee occasionally referred to Hooker as Mr. F.J. Hooker, which of course was not intended to be flattery, I don't think. So. And no, Hookers are not named after Joseph Hooker. Just, all right, on that, thank you very much.
You're watching American History TV. 48 hours of programming on American history every weekend on C-SPAN 3. Follow us on Twitter @C-SPAN History for information on our schedule and to keep up with the latest history news.
The C-SPAN bus tour continues its 50 Capitals tour in January with stops in Raleigh, Columbia, Atlanta, and Montgomery. On each visit, we'll speak with state officials during our live Washington Journal program. Follow the tour and join us on January 16th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern for our stop in Raleigh, North Carolina, when our Washington Journal guest is North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein.
This past year marked the centennial of U.S. entry into World War I. This Monday on American History TV, we'll show highlights of our coverage from the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. Here's a preview.
I'm Matt Naylor, President and CEO here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Really, this memorial and museum is such a striking image on the Kansas City skyline, and what a great story goes with that. It was in 1919, soon after the November 1918 armistice, that a group of business leaders gathered and said, let's do something to honor the war dead of Kansas City and create a tribute for peace. And so what you see behind me is the outcome of that, a fundraising campaign that lasted only 2 weeks that raised more than $2.5 million, the equivalent today of about $40 million. And then the people gathering here on this site in 1921 with the 5 Allied commanders, about 100,000 people in a city of about 250,000. And then the remarkable memorial being constructed and opening with President Calvin Coolidge in 1926, and again the people of the community gathering here, at that time about 150,000 people, said to be the largest crowd that the president or a president of the United States had spoken to up until that time. Such was the outpouring of honor for those who had served in World War I right across the nation. And also a yearning for peace and a different sort of future than the most recent past.
Watch highlights from National World War I Museum and Memorial on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. You're watching American History TV, only on C-SPAN 3.
Next on American History TV, we look back 40 years to 1988, when President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev delivered New Year's Day messages. 3 weeks earlier, the two leaders had signed the INF Treaty to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear missiles. President Reagan addressed the Soviet people from the White House, and General Secretary Gorbachev addressed the American people from the Kremlin. This is about 10 minutes.
Good evening. This is Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. I'm speaking to you, the peoples of the Soviet Union, on the occasion of the new year. I know that in the Soviet Union, as it is all around the world, this is a season of hope and expectation, a time for family to gather, a time for prayer, a time to think about peace. That's true in America, too. At this time of year, Americans traveled across the country in their cars, by train or by airplane, to be together with their families. Many Americans, of course, came to the United States from other countries, and at this time of year, they look forward to hosting friends and family from their homelands. Most of us celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah, and as part of those celebrations, we go to church or synagogue, then gather around the family dinner table. After giving thanks for our blessings, we share a traditional holiday meal of goose, turkey, or roast beef and exchange gifts. On New Year's Eve, we gather again, and like you, we raise our glasses in a toast to the year to come, to our hopes for ourselves, for our families, and yes, for our nation and the world. This year, the future of the nation and the world is particularly on our minds. We are thinking of our nation because in the year ahead, we Americans will choose our next president. Every adult citizen has a role to play in the making of this decision. We will listen to what the candidates say, we will debate their views and our own, and in November, we will vote. I'll still be president next January, but soon after that, the man or woman leading our country will be the one the American people pick this coming November. As I said, we Americans will also be thinking about the future of the world this year, for the same reasons that you will be thinking of it too. In a few months, General Secretary Gorbachev and I hope to meet once again, this time in Moscow. Last month in Washington, we signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, in which we agreed to eliminate an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. It was a history-making step toward reducing the nuclear arms of both sides. But it was just a beginning. Now in Geneva, Soviet and American representatives are discussing a 50% reduction in strategic nuclear weapons. Perhaps we can have a treaty ready to sign by our meeting in spring. The world prays that we will. We on the American side are determined to try. You see, we have a vision of a world safe from the threat of nuclear war, and indeed all war. Such a world would have far fewer missiles and other weapons. Today, both America and the Soviet Union have an opportunity to develop a defensive shield against ballistic missiles, a defensive shield that will threaten no one. For the sake of a safer peace, I am committed to pursuing the possibility that technology offers. The General Secretary and I also anticipate continuing our talks about other issues of deep concern to our peoples. For example, the expansion of contact between our peoples and more information flowing across our borders. Expanding contacts and information will require decisions about life at home that will have an impact on relations abroad. This is also true in the area of human rights. As you know, we Americans are concerned about human rights, including freedoms of speech, press, worship, and travel. We will never forget that a wise man has said that violence does not live alone and is not capable of living alone. It is necessarily interwoven with falsehood. Silence is a form of falsehood. We will always speak out on behalf of human dignity. We Americans are also concerned, as I know you are, about senseless conflicts in a number of regions. In some instances, regimes backed by foreign military power are oppressing their own peoples, giving rise to popular resistance and the spread of fighting beyond their borders. Too many mothers, including Soviet mothers, have wept over the graves of their fallen sons. True peace means not only preventing a big war, but ending smaller ones as well. This is why we support efforts to find just, negotiated solutions acceptable to the peoples who are suffering in regional wars. There is no such thing as inevitability in history. We can choose to make the world safer and freer if we have courage. But then, courage is something neither of our peoples have ever lacked. We have been allies in a terrible war, a war in which the Soviet peoples gave the ages an enduring testament to courage. Let us consecrate this year to showing not courage for war, but courage for peace. We owe this to mankind. We owe it to our children and their children and generations to come. Happy New Year. Thank you, and God bless you.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, as we celebrate the new year, I am glad to address the citizens of the United States of America and to convey to you season's greetings and best wishes from all Soviet people. The 1st of January is a day when we take stock of the past year and try to look ahead into the coming year. The past year, 1987, ended with an event which can be regarded as a good omen. In Washington, President Reagan and I signed the treaty on the elimination of intermediate and short-range missiles. That treaty marks the first step along the path of reducing nuclear arms, and that is its enduring value. But the treaty also has another merit. It has brought our two peoples closer together. We are entering the new year with a hope for continued progress towards a safer world. We are ready to continue fruitfully the negotiations on reducing strategic arms with a view to signing a treaty to that effect even in the first half of this year. We would like without delay to address the problem of cutting back drastically conventional forces and arms in Europe. We are ready for interaction in resolving other problems, including regional ones. I think it can be said that one of the features of the past year was the growing mutual interest our two peoples took in each other. Contacts between Soviet and American young people, war veterans, scientists, teachers, astronauts, businessmen, and cultural leaders have expanded greatly. Like thousands of strands, those contacts are beginning to weave into what I would call a tangible fabric of trust and growing mutual understanding. It is the duty of Soviet and American political leaders to keep in mind the sentiment of the people in their countries and to reflect their will in political decisions. The Soviet people are getting down to work in the new year with an awareness of their great responsibility for the present and for the future. There will be profound changes in our country along the lines of continued perestroika, democratization, and radical economic reform. In the final analysis, all this will let us move onto a broad avenue of accelerated development. We know that you Americans have quite a few problems too. In grappling with those problems, however, I feel that both you and we must remember what is truly crucial. Human life is equally priceless, whether in the Soviet Union, the United States, or in any other country. So let us spare no effort to affirm peace on earth. Ladies and gentlemen, during the official departure ceremony in Washington, I said with regret that on that visit, I had had little chance to see America. I feel, however, that I did understand what is most important about the American people, and that is their enormous stock of goodwill. Let me assure you that Soviet people, too, have an equally great stock of goodwill. Putting it to full use is the most noble and responsible task of government and political leaders in our two countries. If they could only do that, what is but a dream today would come true. A lasting peace, an end to the arms race, wider-ranging trade, cooperation in combating hunger, disease, and environmental problems, and progress in ensuring human rights and resolving other humanitarian issues. May the coming year of 1988 become an important milestone as we move down that road. In concluding this New Year address to the people of the United States of America, I wish peace, happiness, and joy to every American family. A Happy New Year to all of you.
To tweet us at C-SPAN History, a tweet from Madmen Across the Water asking about an issue that still resounds today. And his question is about how many people were fathered by GIs, U.S. GIs in Vietnam. How are they treated 45 years after the U.S. departure?
You could be featured during our next live program. Join the conversation on Facebook at facebook.com/C-SPAN History and on Twitter at C-SPAN History.
Monday night on The Communicators, a look at the Internet, broadband expansion, and 5G with U.S. Telecom President and CEO Jonathan Spalter. He's interviewed by Kyle Daly, senior tech and telecom reporter for Bloomberg Law.
You mentioned that the groups that you represent, the companies you represent, have a lot of work to do. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, we hear a lot about 5G networks, these ultra-fast, ultra-dense wireless broadband networks. Can you talk about how we get to that stage?
Sure. The essential ingredient, the indispensable ingredient to moving forward, not only with extending more broadband to more Americans, but also ensuring our global competitiveness, is this wonderful technology called broadband. Our companies are committed to continue to make the investments to provide the fiber, the resources, the infrastructure, the networks to get more broadband connectivity to more Americans. It takes a lot of work. It takes the right amount of investment. It takes the right types of business models, but it also takes the right types of smart 21st century forward-looking policy frameworks that can actually accelerate and advance and incent the innovation and the investment that's required for us to move forward.
Watch The Communicators, Monday night on C-SPAN 2.
This weekend on American History TV, historian James Oakes talks about the consequences of fugitive slave laws. He argues that tensions between slave and free states over fugitive slaves was one of the leading factors in the 1850s, leading to the Civil War. Here's a preview.
In the immediate aftermath of 1787, northern states, acting on the principle of comity, had passed a series of laws allowing slaveholders to sojourn with their slaves in northern states. Southern owners could bring their slaves with them, often for months at a time, into states where slavery had been or was being abolished. But after 1830, northern states began to restrict the right of sojourn, so that by the 1850s it was legally dangerous for southern slaveholders to travel with their slaves through most northern states. By far the greatest legal obstacle to the gradual emancipation of the North was the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, an obstacle that proved in the end to be one of the most potent sources of sectional tension in the 1850s, second only to the territorial expansion of slavery. I will return to the fugitive slave issue later on, but for now I want to emphasize that the sequence of events we call the crisis of the 1850s needs to be understood against this broader background of the contrasting trajectories of the North and the South, the extraordinary growth of the Cotton Kingdom with which we are all familiar, against the gradual emancipation of the North, a less familiar part of the story.
Watch the entire program at 4:30 p.m. Eastern on Sunday. American History TV, only on C-SPAN 3.
Next, on Lectures in History, American University lecturer Aaron Bell teaches a class about privacy laws and federal surveillance of civil rights leaders. He describes the mid-20th century creation of the counterintelligence program, often called COINTELPRO, and their tracking and infiltrating of domestic political organizations. His class is about 45 minutes.
Well, welcome to class, everybody. Today we're going to talk about history of government surveillance. And the sort of central question I want to think about today is, can intelligence agencies operate in a democratic society and be successful in protecting the government and its citizens while also upholding those same citizens' rights, right? Especially the right to dissent. In other words, are liberty and security compatible? No doubt, there is a need for intelligence communities to operate, right? Threats exist from foreign and domestic sources. Those threats are real. They've been real throughout U.S. history, and they can come from across the political spectrum. But for over a century, in addition to taking action against real threats to the lives of American citizens, bureaus and agencies within the United States government have surveilled those who have expressed what the Cato Institute describes as, quote, strong political views that run counter to the prevailing government political paradigm. This challenges the notion often expressed by those who support a surveillance state of some sort, that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And I'll want to come back to that later on in our class discussion. Now, maybe you really adhere to that view. Maybe you have kind of on the fence about it. Maybe you firmly reject it. That's fine. We'll have an opportunity to discuss that later. But the history of abuses in domestic surveillance in this country necessitates that discussion, because the same tools that can be used to protect citizens in a democratic society, again, from legitimate threats, can also be turned against those same citizens for less noble and even nefarious reasons. If you really want to look at the sort of history of surveillance in the United States, you'd go back probably about a century to 1908. Teddy Roosevelt's Attorney General creates a special squad of investigators to work on behalf of the Department of Justice. Becomes known as the Bureau of Investigation, and then by the 1930s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The FBI's own history, if you go on their website, they have a pretty long narrative description of their history, and they link the creation of an FBI to the progressive movement that is really active at that period of time, at the turn of the century. Right? The progressive movement, it's sort of the sort of belief that undergirds it is that the federal government must intervene to foster justice in an industrial society. Right? It's a response to the sort of labor unrest that we've talked about in previous classes and everything that went along, right, that inspired that, the terrible kind of working conditions and so forth. So the progressive movement inspires things, for example, like the FDA, right, to ensure that the food you're getting is that right, has labels and what you're eating is actually what you think you're eating. Right, it'll eventually lead to things like child labor laws, but it will also then create this sort of nationwide law enforcement body that is able to keep tabs on criminals throughout the country that did not exist prior to this period in time. The FBI's history explains, again, this creation based on the need for a professional law enforcement agency in the face of labor conflict, a rise in violent crime and corruption, both in politics and in big business. All of that, accompanying urbanization and industrialization at the turn of the century. As well as national security concerns, particularly regarding anarchism, right, what the FBI on its own description describes as the first modern-day terrorists, as well as threats of wartime subversion and espionage, which we talked about the other week when we talked about free speech. In 1909, the FBI makes its first efforts to infiltrate political organizations, beginning with the Socialist Party of America. By the mid-1910s, they're investigating anti-militarist and anti-enlistment groups. And over the years, the FBI will spy on a variety of organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union, the Evangelical American Council of Churches, the American Jewish Congress, the Nationwide Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Ethical Society of Philadelphia, the New Orleans Women's Center, the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker social justice organization, the Women's Peace Movement, led by Jane Addams, pro-labor, anti-war folk singers like Pete Seeger, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes these people and organizations are investigated for decades. These are not violent revolutionary threats, right, but rather political dissidents who oppose certain aspects of U.S. government policy and perhaps even the particular form of government that we have. But they do so through pacific means, ostensibly protected under the Constitution, though, as we noted in our class on free speech, not so much right at the turn of the century when anarchist and leftist thought is strictly policed. Political spying will begin right around 1908, 1909, and will run until about 1924, and then will stop for about a decade. And the impetus to stop it is what's known as the First Red Scare. Immediately after the First World War comes to an end, right, November of 1918. That following year, November 1919, sees a number of actions that will raise a lot of concerns about government surveillance. The Seattle General Strike in the early part of 1919, right, shuts down that city. Tens of thousands of workers go on strike across industries. In the spring of 1919, a bomb plot is broken up. And then there's a wave of bombings in the summer, anarchist bombings targeting prominent people, including the Attorney General, Alexander Palmer. His house is down on about R, and right before you get to the kind of main circle there, where R hits Massachusetts. I realized at some point that was his house, and I've been driving by it for years. It was super weird. The Bureau of Investigation creates this thing called the Radical Division to sort of deal with this resurgence of anarchism, headed by a young agent named J. Edgar Hoover. It compiles files on roughly 200,000 individuals. The Bureau then uses those files are then used to round up several thousand suspected radicals in a series of raids in 1919 and 1920 that occur in at least 40 cities across the United States. Some of the people rounded up are well-known prominent radicals. The anarchist Emma Goldman, who is a Russian immigrant to the United States. Other people are arrested simply because they appeared foreign, were members of a labor union, and so forth. Many of those arrested were held incommunicado for months, no access to lawyers, no access to their families, and 249 resident aliens are put on a boat and deported to Russia at the end of 1919 because of their alleged anarchist and syndicalist beliefs. There is a tremendous political backlash against this, in particular because, right, many of these people who are rounded up, again, they are not engaged in radical, violent behavior. They instead are political dissidents. Now, maybe they hold very radical views, but right, nonetheless, right, they have not exactly engaged in anything. And some of them are simply right immigrants, immigrants from Russia, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the political backlash against this brings the FBI's political spying to a temporary halt. This is made especially palatable to those who are in power and may have been inclined to support this kind of roundup at first, in part because of new immigration quotas that are put in place in 1924. These quotas restrict immigrants from Southern and Central Europe, totally shut down immigration from East Asia, which we'll talk about next week in the context of talking about Japanese-American internment. 1929 sees the end of a 10-year-long intelligence gathering program run by an organization known as the Black Chamber, because they have picked a more nefarious name. This is made up of people from the State Department and Army intelligence. Essentially for 10 years, starting in 1919 and running until 1929, U.S. telegraph companies like Western Union had provided the Black Chamber with incoming and outgoing cable traffic. This is shut down by President Hoover's incoming Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, right, not to be confused with J. Edgar Hoover. Stimson specifically opposes spying on the U.S.'s diplomatic allies, not necessarily spying in general, but spying on the U.S.'s diplomatic allies, saying very famously, gentlemen don't read each other's mail. There's also a Supreme Court case at the end of the 20s that deals with wiretapping and weighing whether or not tapping into someone's phone conversation, you have to imagine this is right early on in this period where there are phones, does that violate the Fourth Amendment? Here's what the Fourth Amendment says. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. William Howard Taft, right, formerly President of the United States, then joins the Supreme Court. He speaks for the court's decision to basically rule against the notion that wiretapping violates the Fourth Amendment. The court essentially approves this, and that approval will last for roughly 40 years. Here's what he says. Again, this is in favor of ruling in favor of wiretaps, claiming they don't violate the Fourth Amendment. Congress may, of course, protect the secrecy of telephone messages by making them, when intercepted, inadmissible in evidence in federal criminal trials by direct legislation. Right? If Congress wants to rule on this, they can. And thus depart from the common law of evidence. But the courts may not adopt such a policy by attributing an enlarged and unusual meaning to the Fourth Amendment. The reasonable view is that one who installs in his house a telephone instrument with connecting wires intends to project his voice to those quite outside, and that the wires beyond his house and messages while passing over them are not within the protection of the Fourth Amendment. Those who intercepted the projected voices were not in the house of either party to the conversation. Neither the cases we have cited nor any of the many federal decisions brought to our attention hold the Fourth Amendment to have been violated as against a defendant unless there has been an official search and seizure of his person, or such a seizure of his papers or his tangible material effects, or an actual physical invasion of his house for the purpose of making a seizure. A standard which would forbid the reception of evidence if obtained by other than nice ethical conduct by government officials would make society suffer and give criminals greater immunity than has been known heretofore. So again, right, what he is saying here is that if you are using a telephone machine, it is connected to wires that go outside of the house and speak to someone outside of your home, and thus someone tapping into the wire is not right actually going into your house and searching your belongings. Right, that is outside of your home, and thus does not fall under the auspices of the Fourth Amendment. This is how the court rules, right, in 1928. But I want to hit again on this last thing that he says. Let me say it again. A standard which would forbid the reception of evidence if obtained by other than nice ethical conduct by government officials would make society suffer and give criminals greater immunity than has been known heretofore. Louis Brandeis, who in the 20s, right, set the kind of standard for free speech in his dissent that ultimately then became the court's, right, ruling many decades down the road, he dissented in this case as well. And here's what he said, in particular regarding Taft's last comments, which are essentially, right, in some ways saying that the ends justifies the means. Here's what Brandeis says. Decency, security, and liberty alike demand that government officials shall be subjected to the same rules of conduct that are commands to the citizen. In a government of laws, existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Let's try that again. In a government of laws, existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher, for good or for ill. It teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. To declare that in the administration of the criminal law, the end justifies the means, to declare that the government may commit crimes in order to secure the conviction of a private criminal, would bring terrible retribution. Against this pernicious doctrine, this court should resolutely set its face. Political spying ends from roughly, right, the early 20s until 1936, when Franklin Roosevelt requests that it be resumed. What we'll see very clearly here, right, is that government surveillance, again, it does not necessarily target any one particular group, though historically its targets have leaned left, not always, nor is it simply the purveyance of one particular political party or ideology. Franklin Roosevelt, right, the great liberal Democrat, requests that political spying be reinitiated in 1936. It will be led by our man up here, J. Edgar Hoover, appointed head of the Bureau of Investigation in 1924 at the age of 29, younger than I am. Hoover had helped put together the lists that had been used in the first Red Scare to round up a vast swath of people, but nonetheless he managed to kind of escape the political fallout of that, right? The sort of blade came down on the heads of a few people higher up than him. And the Bureau had rebounded within that decade. Hoover had really tried to emphasize the Bureau's role as a crime-fighting organization, particularly in the 1930s, when during the Depression you have this sort of some famous criminals that arise, people like John Dillinger that the FBI put a lot of work into capturing. Hoover emphasizes this, knows how to kind of work the media in his favor.